אנחנו רוצים להתחיל. אפשר להתחיל. אולי לסגור את הדלת שם? אפשר לסגור את הדלת? I'm really happy to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Len Adamson. Professor Len Adamson just arrived 2 hours ago from New York, and that's a long journey to the Middle East, not only flight-wise, and I really appreciate it. Len Adamson is a director of the Museum of Art and Design, MED, in New York City. He was until autumn 2013 the head of research at the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where he was active as a curator, historian, and theorist. His publications include, I think, the most famous is Thinking Through Craft. Probably most of you know that. The Craft Reader from 2010, Invention of the Craft and Postmodern Style and Subversion, which was a very big and interesting exhibition in the V&A and a catalog that he produced, and Global Design, which is a very interesting look at design from a global perspective. He's also a co-founder and editor of the triannual Journal of Modern Craft. Professor Adamson, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here in Israel with you and to be here at Btzalel. I can tell you that from a distance of 11 hours flight away that Btzalel has a fantastic reputation, not only in New York but also in London. And so I've been hearing about this institution for many years and know well some of its graduates, I think particularly of Daniel Charney, who I knew through the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art, and made such a huge impact on the way that people think about making in London. And he's just one of many people that is in my mind as I stand here before you today to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing now that I have arrived in New York City. I've been the director of this institution, Museum of Arts and Design, for just 7 months. And so it's a great pleasure to be here to tell you about it. And I do want to also thank Ori and everybody else that's given me such a warm welcome. And I've already had lots of great conversations here, although I've only arrived a couple of hours ago. So my story recently is epitomized by this slide, the Victoria and Albert Museum to MAD. Two very, very different institutions in many respects. So, for example, the Victoria and Albert Museum, by some measures, has 2.5 million objects in its care and has about 750 staff, of which 250, again, depends how you count, about 250 are curators. MAD, Museum of Arts and Design, which is in Columbus Circle, right at the corner of Central Park in New York City, has not 2.5 million objects, but 4,000 objects. It has not 750 staff, but about 50, and not 250 curators, but about 3. 4 if you count me. But there's also a lot that the two institutions have in common. One thing which I like to point out to my friends back in London is that actually the tagline of the V&A is the world's greatest museum of arts and design, which I think bespeaks the shared project of this truly vast Victorian institution and this cool little snappy building on a traffic circle. This is in fact the only traffic circle in Manhattan, the only round thing in the traffic pattern of Manhattan. The building is worth saying a little bit about. It was just opened 5 years ago, and it's by an architect called Brad Klopfel. You may have heard that there was an absolutely enormous dispute about the architecture of this building. It occupied a site that previously already had a museum on it called the Huntington Hartford building. It was a private museum. And the building was derelict and very much unloved by everybody around, seemingly, until my predecessor decided to come along and basically knock it down and build this in its place, at which point a lot of preservationists decided that they thought the building was quite important after all. So there were a lot of debates about whether this should happen. It did happen. As I said, it opened 5 years ago, and it's become, I think, in fact, a very well-loved landmark there on the west side of Manhattan. And one of the very distinctive features about it, as you can see, is this sort of channel of light that is carved into the surface of the building. And it really is an elegant piece of, I suppose you might say, neo-modernism. So an extraordinary platform for doing something. And the question is what? So the name Museum of Arts and Design is, as I always like to say, a name that perhaps captures your attention, but may make you say, tell me more. Which arts and design? What does that mean exactly? So it's worth saying that the institution was founded a long time ago by this lady here, Eileen Osborne Vanderbilt Webb. And it was founded as the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1956, long time ago, in fact. It spent a little while as the American Craft Museum, and then became the Museum of Arts and Design about 10 years ago. Eileen Webb, fascinating person, our founder. She was certainly the most important craft philanthropist and advocate active in America in the 20th century. In addition to our institution, and there I show you an image of the first building, again founded in 1956, a kind of converted, modernized townhouse over on 53rd Street, right next to the Museum of Modern Art. And in fact, if you've been to 53rd Street recently, you know that enormous building, Museum Tower, that was built right plunk on top of our building, which is why we had to move in the early 70s. So that's the original architecture of our building. Eileen Osborne Webb also founded the World Crafts Council exactly 50 years ago, this year, 1964. And she did lots of other things too. She founded a school for teaching craft. She started a magazine now called American Craft, and the associated national council, the American Craft Council. She staged conferences. She had a store. She had a lot of energy. But what she was really interested in, above all, was the idea that craft could be understood as a mechanism for change. And she was particularly interested in the idea that craft and design could work together in some way to improve the world around us, to humanize the world around us, to create objects and perhaps buildings as well that were more well-considered, more nuanced, more functional, more beautiful than what mass production would produce if left to its own devices. So that's what Eileen Osborne Webb had in mind. How do we interpret this this legacy, this mission today? And that's really what I want to talk to you about. This is just one of the galleries at MAD open, and you can see that carved light channel there that I mentioned earlier. And I suppose arriving at the museum 7 months ago, I was faced with this big open question. How do you run a craft museum in the 21st century? And also, what do we make of the idea of a craft museum that doesn't have the word craft in the name any longer? And it was, I think, a very pointed move for the museum to drop that word, the C word, from its title 10 years ago and instead become the Museum of Arts and Design. Clearly, there's some discomfort around the idea of craft, which perhaps implies too much tradition, too much history, too much backward-looking stasis. And so a craft museum from its founding, but also a sense of deep discomfort with the idea of being a museum that's too rooted in the past. So how to fill these galleries in a way that is true to the mission and the founding insights of Eileen Osborne Webb and everybody else that's brought the museum to its very healthy state today, but also is thoroughly forward-facing and ready to greet the future and fully adequate to the needs of the 21st century. So what we've come up with is an exhibition about making and about makers. And it's really a project that's intended to answer this question: what does it mean to be a maker producing work in New York City today? the reason that I use the word making and maker rather than craft and craftsperson is partly precisely to avoid the conversation about being mired in tradition. And partly, I suppose, to be totally honest, is also trying to avoid the very specific history of that word with this institution, which has been very thoroughly debated. And making seems to me to get us out of that conversation and perhaps into a new discursive space just through a very quick maneuver of terminology. And in fact, it is a word that I suppose you could say Daniel Charney taught me to use. He did an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, wildly successful, attended by something like 330,000 people, called The Power of Making. And the thesis of that exhibition, if you're aware of it, is very much that the world is full of makers of all kinds, and we can look at them all together as a kind of continuum of practice, you could say. And so I was very inspired by this idea, this project, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at makers citywide, entirely from one urban landscape? And so we came up with this show called NYC Makers, the Mad Biennial. It is a biennial in the sense that we'll be looking at a different city every 2 years. So starting with New York City, partly for practical reasons, because when you want to try to put together an exhibition in 7 months, it helps to go local. So the attraction of people being able to drop their work off at the back loading dock without having to crate it up first was definitely present in our minds. But also, I really wanted to emphasize New York City as a place where things are in fact made. New York probably has an overwhelming reputation for being a place where you can buy stuff, and also a place where various white-collar industries are practiced, like insurance, obviously the tech sector, banking, and other forms of finance, law, obviously. But when you think of New York City, you don't necessarily think of artisans, you don't necessarily think of craftspeople, you don't necessarily think of production. You instead, as I say, think perhaps more about consumption. So what we wanted to do was to demonstrate to people, first and foremost, that New York City is in fact an absolutely vital community of makers and making. And that just brings to mind another reason that I like this word, maker, making. It is an active word, and it doesn't sound like a category. So if I say to you craft, you probably immediately think of certain disciplines like ceramics, weaving, glass, metalwork. But if I say making, that perhaps opens up a larger space in your head. It might imply technology. It might also imply these more traditional artisanal skills. It's just a less defined space in which to maneuver. And that was really what we wanted to suggest. So when we announced the show back in January, we used this image to advertise it, partly because I just thought it was a kind of stunning and mesmerizing and sort of strange image. What you're looking at, in fact, is the work of a graphic design company called Keitra Dean Dixon. And what they do is to layer colored wax in many, many different sheafs, different colors, and then they cut through it eventually to reveal text. So this is their wax lump having been formed, but waiting to be cut through to reveal a word or a sign. And I loved the idea of this as a kind of image of becoming, an image of potential, like something waiting to be born, almost like a kind of weird handmade egg of conceptual and visual possibility. So they're one of the makers that will be in the show. And what we decided to do was really try to bring the whole community into the process of realizing the project. So here's the structure that we undertook, the kind of curatorial process. We went out to 350 nominators, and the reason we went out to 350 nominators was because that's all we had time for. It would have been great to ask even more people. And we asked each of them to suggest to us the name of between 1 and 3 makers. So we asked them, you know, in terms of criteria, we asked them to suggest people that were very, very skilled, sort of top of their discipline, top of their trade, were contributing something to the community of New York City, and were innovative in what they did. Those were the only 3 rules. And obviously we were thinking about people making things physically also. So not poets or musicians, but people making objects or spaces or tangible experiences of some kind. So from that process, we got back about 450 names. That doesn't sound like a lot coming from 350 nominators, but one reason for that is that lots of people were nominated multiple times by different nominators, which was very encouraging to us. So a lot of people came back with 8, 10, or 12 nominations. And then we put together a panel of 10 jurors who were taken from around the city, and these included representatives of all 5 boroughs of New York City: Manhattan, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Brooklyn, and also some of the staff from the museum, including myself. And then we narrowed down that list of 450 suggestions to 100 makers, and those were the people that are going to be in the show. And as we did that jurying process, what we tried to do was achieve a kind of diversity, not only in terms of the space of the city, and also other things like gender and ethnicity and so on, sort of background of the makers, but also crucially in terms of what they did. So what we were trying to do was find 100 makers, all of whom had different skill sets, different things that they were able to do, and different kinds of work. So a true kind of cross-section of an entire city's making culture. And I think the reason that it's important to me to have undertaken this democratic process is because one of the ways that I really want to fill those empty galleries that I just showed you is to create the sense that the museum is open to its environment and particularly open to the creative community around it. If I could sort of swing open the doors and just let the exhibition pour in of its own free will, I would. Obviously, that's not a very practical way of curating an exhibition. But what I was really trying to do was suggest that this was not a centralized process. This was not an authoritative process. And it was not meant to be definitive or comprehensive in any way. Rather, it's meant to be a kind of temperature taking or a kind of snapshot of the city and, as I say, its making culture. So we could easily have gone through this exact same process and ended up with 100 different makers and probably had an equally good show. And so it's not meant to be the best 100 makers in New York City. Rather, it's meant to be 100 great makers from New York City, and it implies a certain direction of travel for the institution and a certain set of commitments to a democratic, decentralized, you might even say crowdsourced curatorial strategy. So that's one of the ways in which I'm hoping that this exhibition announces a kind of radical museum practice, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides from now. So what did we actually wind up with in terms of makers? I'm just going to show you a few examples, maybe 10 or 12 examples. Well, some of them did very much occupy the traditional genres in which the museum has operated for its first 60 years. One example of that would be this fellow, Jeff Zimmerman, who is a glassblower, and he's certainly the most skilled young glassblower active in the city, if not on the East Coast right now in America. And one thing that he is particularly well known for is creating these glass vessels that are very much on the point of collapse. So what he does is blow them and then allow them to buckle and swirl against themselves, and then he freezes them at the very moment when they're about to just become puddles, and then he puts them in a annealing oven, slowly cools them down so that they retain that form. So they're almost like balloon animals or something, but made of glass. Quite extraordinary work. And then he surfaces them with various forms of silvering and applied color, as you can see here. So we did wind up with quite a few makers who operated in these kinds of disciplines: woodwork, ceramic, glass, jewelry, things that we have shown in our galleries, as I say, for decades. But of course, we're also called the Museum of Arts and Design, and one thing that I really wanted to do was make sure that we included the full range of fine art and the full range of design in all of its applications: graphics, industrial design, architecture. So from the fine arts category, just for example, we have this wonderful artist, Leslie Wayne, who works in paint. So she is, you could say, a painter, but she works in paint sculpturally. So believe it or not, this object is entirely made of paint. There's nothing underneath the paint. It's simply been layered over and over again, rather like that wax study that I showed you earlier. And she is able to create, again, this very live, active surface and this extraordinary object that seems like, again, it's caught in the act of its own becoming. I think this is something that pops up in the show a lot. You see it in Jeff Zimmerman's work as well. There seems to be an aesthetic interest on the part of many of the makers of expressing the process or the techniques by which the thing is made as if they were caught in flight, you could say. This is a great example of that. Design-wise, we have people like Lindsey Adelman, who's a great and increasingly renowned lighting designer. Here she is standing next to the piece that she'll be contributing to the exhibition. This will be in the lobby of the museum. And she's a great example of somebody in the show who is a very successful entrepreneur. And this is another register of meaning or importance for the show. One thing I've been saying is that I hope that the exhibition will be reviewed in the business pages of the newspapers in New York as much as it is in the art pages. Because I feel that when you think about making in a city, really what you're thinking about above all is the capacity of the city to realize new ideas and the capacity of individuals in the city to create viable businesses that change the status quo, that move the conversation forward in their own particular area. So Lindsey is a great example of that. Trained designer who produces all of her work in-house with a very small group of makers, and has, through that strategy, been able to create lighting that's very stylish, very successful, used in residences, used in hotels, and so on. So really exploiting the local network of institutions that might act as her clientele. And I think it's only through a commitment to the real skills of both design and making that she's been able to do that. And more broadly, the argument here is that making these days in the 21st century is increasingly becoming not only a viable but also a crucial driver for the economy of a city like New York. One thing that I'm quite interested in here is the way that the artisanal and the digital sort of hold hands in this process. And that's both in the sense that a lot of the objects in the show are either designed or fabricated using digital processes. So Lindsey, for example, uses a lot of digital tools when designing her work. But also in terms of distribution, the very fact of being able to sell your work online makes it possible to be an artisan in a totally new way, because you can have a production shop that's very local and draws on local resources, and you can sell your work not only through the city but through the whole world, just like Amazon does. And that's created a whole new set of possibilities for makers. And I think we're familiar with this perhaps mainly through online platforms like Etsy, where you have a kind of mass phenomenon of amateur craftsmanship and sort of low-level professional craftsmanship. But that's just as true for these kind of high-flying design entrepreneurs like Lindsey, as it is for the more general community of amateur makers. And I really wanted to signal that, the new possibilities of entrepreneurship that are arising for the making community. So that's, if you like, the craft, art, and design sectors that the museum covers. But I wanted also for the show to capture a sense of the diversity and, in a way, almost the eccentricity or specificity of making culture in New York City. So the next few slides I'm going to show you are perhaps a little less predictable. One of those is the work of Marian Eleanor, who is the United States leading practitioner of verre et glomise, which is reverse glass painting. And she's another great example of somebody who is virtually unique and has an absolutely thriving business model doing this kind of work, largely for very high-end residences. I think it's worth saying, or maybe even admitting, that one of the factors that is prevalent in New York City is simply the concentration of extremely high amounts of wealth in the city. So you have patrons for people like Marian Eleanor in New York that wouldn't exist anywhere else in the country except for maybe Los Angeles. It's a very stark contrast to the making cultures that you have in other places in America. For example, Detroit, which we're thinking about as the location for the next biennial in 2016. Detroit makers are thriving because why? Deregulation, in other words, the government's not paying attention to what they're doing, extremely low rents, and a lot of space, right? That's why making things in Detroit makes sense. In New York, of course, it's the opposite. Real estate's extremely expensive. What you do is being watched very closely by all kinds of regulatory agencies. But on the flip side, you have patrons, almost like the Medici, for great craftspeople during the Renaissance. And I think, we have to admit that there's a lot of asymmetries and disparities in terms of wealth in New York. It's a very divided city in that way. But say what you will about that situation, obviously that's a very complex political reality to face. It certainly provides a context or a kind of ecosystem in which people like Marian Eleanor can thrive. What about the arts of repair? This is not something that the museum has looked at in the past very much, but it's something I'm myself very interested in. I actually did a whole exhibition about repair at a gallery in London when I was there. And we stumbled across this great example out in Brooklyn of a place called Brass Lab. They are the United States' leading repairer and restorer of brass instruments. So if you are the tuba player or trumpet player at the New York Philharmonic, for example, and your trumpet gets smashed while it's in transit from one concert to another, and it's an extremely valuable instrument, you're going to send it to Brass Lab to get it fixed. And of course, they are hugely skilled metal workers, but they're not making things from scratch. They're making things that either improve on or simply restore to original condition an existing object. And I think it's very interesting to include that within the remit of what we call making, sort of remaking practices rather than making from scratch. And it's in fact one of the most interesting places of all the various workshops that are involved in the show, one of the most interesting places to visit because of the huge diversity of tools and materials and instruments and so on that they have present there. I think, repair is a great example of the way that making involves adaptability, flexibility, and a readiness to deal with whatever comes up next, because you never know what's going to come in the door if you're in the repair business. And so this is a great example of the way that making is above all about not just innovation, but also innovation in response to a specific set of circumstances. And that's just as true for somebody who's making from scratch for a certain marketplace, but I think it becomes more abundantly evident when you come to the question of repair. Another really important theme within the exhibition is makers who work within an institutional context. And this is something that the museum has looked at very little in the past, but I'm extremely interested in it and something that I want to see the museum do a lot more of in the future. So for example, we have the set designers and prop makers at the Metropolitan Opera heavily involved in the exhibition. And these are people who would not normally be experienced by the public at all, except in a kind of experiential, unstated way. Because of course, when you go to the opera, you're thinking about the singing, you're thinking about the orchestra, you're thinking about the director. You might be thinking about the libretto and the score and the composer. But you're very unlikely to think about the specific people who actually made the sets and the props and the costumes that you're seeing on stage. And so we're going to have all of those people present in the exhibition, chunks of set that we've borrowed from the opera, a prop, which is actually quite cool. It's a candelabra that spontaneously lights into flame and then douses itself. And we're also going to have representations of the work of the lead costume beader for the Metropolitan Opera, the person who does all the beadwork for the divas and performers. There's also the subcultural context, sort of cut against that idea of the massive, famous institution. So believe it or not, the single category where we got the most nominations of any type of making in New York City was tattoo art. It's a kind of interesting statistic for you. And the tattoo artist that we chose of the ones that were proposed was Amanda Wacob, who does these extraordinary painterly tattoos. I was actually quite surprised that she was able to get away with this, because it seems to me that most people who want a tattoo have quite a clear idea of what they want on their body for the rest of their lives. But apparently she is sufficiently beloved by her constituency that she's able to just paint on people and make a career of it, which is amazing. It also raises the question of how you represent this in the exhibition space. But we're thinking a slideshow rather than live naked people. but in all seriousness, the question of subcultures as contexts in which making is propagated and skills are generated and sustained is also, of course, of huge interest in any urban environment, and New York City is no exception to that. And then you just have kind of wacko, oddball examples, which I particularly love and are kind of quite good for us in promoting the show and creating press attention. And maybe my favorite example of that is this artisanal candy making company called Papa Bubble. And interestingly, they work in a way that's not dissimilar from Jeff Zimmerman's glass or Keitra Dean Dixon's wax work. They do a lot of layering and cutting, and of course they work not hot to the extent the glass is, obviously, but they work warm, and they also work in teams. And I think another thing that's maybe worth saying while looking at this slide is that a lot of the makers that we're talking about in the show are not individual people, but rather collaboratives, groups of people that work together, often with offsetting or complementary skill sets. And Papa Bubble would be a great example of that. And it just sort of makes for good copy in the New York Times as well. Maybe my favorite example of the makers in the show, and the one that I use to, I suppose, try to signify what this show is meant to do and how different it is from what the museum has done in the past, and indeed what any museum probably has done in the past, is that we have one of our own crate makers from the company Box Art in the show. And this is a little bit like the Metropolitan Opera case study, where you have these set builders, prop makers, costume makers present. But of course, this is our backstage craft, crate making. Why is crate making interesting? Well, for starters, it's just like repair. It's an adaptive, flexible, responsive craft, because like the repairman at Brass Lab getting a trumpet that they have to fix, a crate maker has a given object. You might even call it a found object, a kind of weird reversal of the Duchampian dynamic. So the sculpture or whatever it is comes into their shop, and they have to build the crate around it, and then it has to be shipped safely across the country or maybe even overseas, minimizing risk to the object. So they have to build an armature, padding, and essentially build a sculpture to hold the sculpture, you could say. And this is precisely the kind of making that people never think about. They don't meet the crate maker, they don't see the crate. It's stored in the basement in our storage facility, and yet it is absolutely crucial to what we do. And in fact, it is the craft about which my own staff probably knows most, because they interact with crate makers all the time, and we commission crate makers all the time. So you might say that in this respect, we are like a patron for the makers. And so what we're doing is showing one of the objects in our collection, a piece of furniture, particularly elaborate and complex shaped piece of furniture by an artist named Wendell Castle, with its crate. So we're simply bringing that out from storage and putting it in the show to represent our friends at Box Art who do so much work for us. And it's this kind of exposure to the backstage realities of making, institutional making, urban making, that we wanted to excavate. I'll come back to that in a second, but I just wanted to say one last thing about the show before I move on to some concluding remarks about where the museum might be going next. Another thing that I really wanted to do with this show is have it be hugely fun to visit. This show is opening on July 1st, so it's summertime. We're right at the corner of Central Park. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of people walking past the museum's doors all the time. And I wanted the museum to kind of scream to people walking by, come visit, this is going to be an absolute blast. And it's as much of a festival as it is a serious exhibition. Ideally, it's both. So we've done a couple of things in order to achieve that. One is that we're going to give our lobby, which normally looks like this, very restrained kind of classical modernism, just like the exterior that I showed you earlier. We're going to give the lobby to these people, who are called Confetti Systems, and they normally work after hours creating parties. That's their business. So they use mylar, like the material that you get for shiny balloons, and other, confetti and streamers and so on, and they make these absolutely extraordinary, elaborate, reflective, highly colorful environments, and we're going to allow them to decorate our lobby with that Lindsey Adelman chandelier that I showed you earlier hanging down in the middle of it. And then in the lobby, we're also going to stage various kinds of events. For example, we're going to have a cake maker come in one weekend and build an enormous cake, hugely elaborately festooned with icing decoration. And then at the end of the day on Sunday, we're going to let everybody eat it. So that's about the craft of the confectioner, I guess you could say. In the back stairway of the museum, I don't have a picture of the stairs, unfortunately, but they're stairs, nothing too exciting, usually. We're giving the stairs over to these folks, Flavor Paper, who are the leading artisanal wallpaper manufacturer in New York City. And they have collaborated with a graphic designer who's done a pattern for the wallpaper. And believe it or not, they're also collaborating with a perfume designer to create a three-story installation of wallpaper that has 3 different scents over the 3 floors. The bottom floor is the base notes of the perfume, so the musky bottom notes of the perfume. And the middle floor, second floor, you get the addition of the mid-tones of the perfume. And then on the top floor, you get the high floral notes, and the perfume is completed. And it's scratch and sniff wallpaper. So you walk up the stairs scratching away and smelling this perfume being built. So it's actually being made not before your eyes, but before your nose, you might say. So this is another way that we're trying to activate the museum. And just more generally, it's a very important principle for me that the museum is absolutely filled with makers and making all the time. We have a set of open studios at the museum, which are currently occupied by this fellow called Chris Pelletieri. He's the lead stone carver at the big cathedral in New York City called St. John the Divine. And unfortunately, there was a fire in the cathedral recently, and so he lost his studio. It was wiped out by the fire. So we've asked him to come in to our open studios, and he's set up there, and he's carving away, and he's actually making a sculpture for the show. And here you see him giving me a stone carving lesson. This is like the tough duty of a director. And it was great to be able to offer him this space to work in, but it was also, I think, a typical example of how we're trying to bring makers into the building, not just in these open studios that we have on our education floor, but also throughout the building. So you're going to have people performing, demonstrating, engaging with audiences all the time. And the idea is that when you round a corner in the show, you might encounter a static object, or you might encounter a maker actually doing something live, depending on when you happen to visit. And this idea of the museum as being more about a verb, making, than about a noun, craft, is, I think, absolutely intrinsic to where we're going to be going as a museum. So that's a little bit about NYC Makers. It's on from July 1st to October 12th if you happen to be in New York. And that was kind of the key example I wanted to give you of the way that I'm approaching the museum. But I did have one last thing to run past you, which is a little bit earlier, at an earlier stage of development, but I think is going to be interesting to you, which is this show called Many Hands, Artists and Their Fabricators. This opens actually all the way in autumn of 2015. And by the way, I'm used to, at the V&A, we used to plan shows about 3 or 4 years in advance. Ori mentioned that I did this show about Post-Modernism that took me and my co-curator 4 years to do. And when I arrived at MAD in October of last year, there were only 2 of 6 shows planned for this year. So I had to come up with 4 shows for this year, and then 6 for next year, and 6 for every year afterwards. So this is one of them. But it's the one that I'm maybe the most excited about coming up next year. And as you can see, it's about the relationship between artists and fabricators. It so happens that this image is of Robert Indiana's Love sculpture, famous sculpture. And it was fabricated at a place called Milgo Bufkin in Brooklyn. And they are also in the NYC Maker Show, as it happens. And I guess you could say that fabricators are rather like crate makers in the sense that they are absolutely intrinsic to the operation of contemporary art today, but nobody ever seems to recognize what they do or the fact that they are even there. And it's this very strange blind spot, it seems to me, in art discourse at the moment. In fact, I think, I'll make a prediction for you. I think art historians of the future, let's say 30 or 50 years from now, are going to look back at our moment, and they're going to overwhelmingly conclude that the fascinating thing that happened in our period in art had nothing to do with content, nothing to do with imagery, nothing to do with ideas, and everything to do with production. Because what's happened in our period is an enormous expansion of the range of possibilities for making in art, principally because of the development of these outsourced fabrication shops. And to me, it seems like an expansion of the means of art, and also a scaling up of the capital that's invested in art that we haven't seen the like of since probably the Renaissance. Art is bigger, it's more expensive, it's made from more and more extravagant and precious materials than it has ever been, probably in the history of the world. Certainly if you think about the profusion of art that's shown in the profusion of art fairs, the profusion of galleries. And most of this, of course, is not being executed by the artists themselves. It's being executed by big teams of people, and you don't know the names of any of them, right? You know, sorry? Undoubtedly one of them is Joe, just law of averages. So Robert Indiana, of course, you've heard of, but how many people in this room have heard of Milgo Bufkin? But in fact, Milgo Bufkin made the work not only of Robert Indiana, but also Donald Judd, Ellsworth Kelly, Joel Shapiro. I could go on. In fact, most of East Coast sculpture from the 60s to the present, and I'm talking here about big sculpture, was made only by about 3 shops, Lippincott, Milgo Bufkin, and Talix, none of which you've probably heard of. And so what we're going to do in this exhibition is focus on the fabricators in the same way that in NYC Makers we're focusing on the crate makers. And in a way, the proposition that I'm making to you and in turn to the public is this. What if a museum were to treat the artist, the fabricator, and the crate maker as equals? All of them are skilled. All of them are necessary to the project of art. All of them are in active communication with one another. And of course, our culture values the artist, the Jeff Koons, the Anish Kapoors, the Rachel White-Reeds, far above the fabricators, and probably the fabricators far above the crate makers, in fact. But without the crate makers, you would never have seen a Jeff Koons, right? And you certainly wouldn't have seen a Jeff Koons without the fabricators, because Jeff Koons doesn't make anything. So what if a museum were to adopt a kind of radical egalitarian approach to this reality of making that animates the art world? Well, it might look something like this. Here's a Mark Quinn, Kate Moss sculpture. You've probably seen these. But you probably haven't seen the inside of AB Fine Art Foundry in London, which is like London's version of Milgo Bufkin, you could say, except they work in casting. And you probably haven't seen this. And in fact, that's a shot that I took on my phone when visiting the foundry. And it's probably not even okay for me to be showing it to you, but since we're in Jerusalem, I figured it's probably safe. And it seems to me that this reality, multiple Kate Moss heads stuck on the shelf, is, what can I say, a more compelling visual and conceptual premise for a museum to lay hold of than any finished sculpture could possibly be. So that is one direction that we're going in, this idea of fabrication. But more generally, what I hope I've left you with today is the idea that making, which at first seems like a kind of conservative thing for a museum to be looking at, almost a kind of 19th century thing to be looking at. You know, how is stuff actually realized? What are the skills? What are the materials? What are the processes? It all sounds rather connoisseurial and could even be seen as backward looking. But on the contrary, focusing on making is a way to address questions of authorship, questions of capital and capitalization, questions of engagement between artists, designers, and the public, and indeed questions of institutional identity, even our own institutional identity at MAD, in a way that perhaps no other subject could possibly manage. So that's what I have to say, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Adamson, for a very interesting lecture. And we'll take some questions. Any questions about the makers, about the makers' trends, or tattoo? Yeah, tattoo. Yeah, sure.
I just couldn't ignore the fact that when you described the show that you're planning, everything seemed very of the spectacle culture, and I thought that making and craft is suggesting something else, and but you're bringing into your museum this culture of spectacle, like to see everywhere else the global economy and all that stuff.
That's a great point. Did everyone hear that in the back? Yeah. So the point, and much a point well taken, is that when you first hear about a show about making, it sounds like it might be more everyday or less spectacular. But one thing that we're doing in the show is to bring in that idea of spectacle culture, and here I guess you're thinking of things like the Metropolitan Opera. So this idea of a kind of cultural economy that's quite theatrical. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
I was a little bit criticizing you.
Yeah.
Actually.
Okay.
Because I feel like you're drink in this approach. It's like more of the same.
Okay. Yeah. So sorry, she just said she's intending to be critical here. Fair enough. Because it's more of the same. In other words, we're reproducing what's out there in the landscape in terms of spectacle culture rather than fighting against it. I take your point. I guess what I would say is that I'm trying to create, with my colleagues, we're trying to create a true portrait of the world outside and the way that makers, the way that it depends on makers. So, I mean, to me, for example, the repaired trumpet or the crate are actually not very spectacular. In fact, they're quite determinedly anti-spectacular, and there are other examples of that too. The stone carver at the cathedral maybe might be another example of that. I'm not sure how that example strikes you. But for sure, whether it's the Metropolitan Opera or this kind of fun candy maker or the lavish parties or the very glamazé painter, the reverse glass painter, we are absolutely capturing making as it is hooked up to the economy in its full breadth. And I guess one thing that I'm trying to do here is, to be perfectly honest, is get the museum and indeed the whole subject area of craft away from its kind of knee-jerk, marginal, like self-marginalizing tendencies. Because my feeling is that since the days of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, there's been this very, I think very almost simplistic, I want to say, sort of left-leaning tendency to think that craft is somehow, by definition, pitted against capitalism and its various powerful engines. And I just don't look at it that way. I think that craft is just as intrinsically necessary to very advanced forms of capitalism as it is in a medieval village. And if we persuade ourselves, like William Morris did, that craft really lives at home in a medieval context and that it is fundamentally opposed to modernity, we completely misunderstand the situation. Having said that, as is probably quite clear, there's an element of not class warfare exactly, but a desire to give credit where credit is due in this approach. So by putting the crate maker out there, what we're saying is, yes, spectacle culture is all around you, but if it weren't for Joe or Jane, then you wouldn't have your spectacle culture. And I think that itself has a kind of politics to it, but it's quite different from the politics of let's change the world and not have this spectacle culture anymore. I guess I kind of feel like that horse has left the barn to some extent. And what I want to do is try to acknowledge, at least maybe it's just as a first step, acknowledge the people that are actually making this world go round. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question regarding this class warfare, or this challenge that you're laying at the foot of the superstar artists.
Mm-hmm.
You say you're superstar artists, but you're actually your art is being made by other people. Are you expecting some criticism or a backlash that has to do with that? Have you already received any sort of reference to that?
Yeah. So the question is about the Many Hands Artists and Fabricators show. So it's a question about the challenge that we're at least implicitly laying at the feet of these superstar artists, like so the Jeff Koonses of the world, and saying, well, let's deal with the fact that you're not making your work and let's think about the consequences of that. So have there been any consequences of us making that gesture yet? So first of all, I can say that we have had a couple of high-profile artists turn us down without any explanation, one of them being Damien Hirst. And when that happened, I was kind of like, yes, because I thought the most useful position that Damien Hirst could possibly serve in this show is as a refuse-nick. Because I'd much rather be able to go around the world to places like this saying Damien Hirst said no to being in the show rather than having his work in the show. It's much better. But having said that, we have had a lot of high-profile artists sign on, including a couple of estates like Donald Judd and Sol LeWitt. Sol LeWitt's a particularly important example because we're going to have a wall drawing made live in the gallery. And you're actually going to be able to see it unfold over the course of the weeks and months of the exhibition, which we think is the first time that's ever been done. And then a lot of quite high-performing contemporary artists like Andrea Zittel, Pei White, Fred Wilson, Jeanine Antoni, Simon Starling. So quite a good list of artists. In fact, ironically, although this exhibition is very much an explicit challenge to standing narratives about art authorship, it's very much a higher level of artist than MAD has had in its galleries before, because we've, generally speaking, tried to represent these sort of craft-based artists, and we haven't really tried to operate in that blue chip arena. So ironically, it's like this jujitsu move. Like, by challenging the blue chip structure, we're actually able to get it into the galleries, whereas we wouldn't have maybe been able to do that by other means. But I will say that we have thought about it a lot because we don't want to be seen as just being like the kid in the Emperor's New Clothes story of saying, aha, Jeff, you didn't make your work. Because that actually in and of itself is not very interesting. In fact, you're just pointing out the blindingly obvious, and once you've done that, where are you? So what we decided to do is focus on artists like LeWitt, for example, who have a very, very considered relationship to their fabricators. So because of course almost all really ambitious art these days is made by fabricators, so you need some way of figuring out who's actually going to be in the exhibition, among other things. So we decided to only look at artists who had a very well-developed narrative and also a very explicit set of relationships to their fabricators, so that it was already very conspicuous in the work, and that was the rationale by which we curated the show. So that's one way that we're trying to get around that sort of immediate criticism that we're just attacking the artists in some way, and that's not at all the case. We're trying to actually voice something that's important to the artists in this show. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a very sensitive way, very narrow, but it's a debate that's going on all the time.
Mm-hmm.
What is an artist and what is the craftsman and maker or what you call the fabricator?
Did everyone hear that? Let me just try to repeat. That was a complicated question, but let me try to summarize by saying, on the one hand, we're glorifying technicians who are not themselves creative artists. And also there's this standing debate about craft versus art that obviously has gone on for a long time. And you feel that in some way we're trying to kind of get out of that, almost like this escape hatch, by glorifying the fabricators. Is that a fair summary? Okay, so here's what I would say about that. First of all, it seems to me that it's not hard to be an artist. Anybody in this room could be an artist. My mother can be an artist. Ori can be an artist.
Most of them are.
Right. Yeah, most of them are. That's how easy it is now. Yeah. So I think being an artist is simply a matter of choice. No more, no less. And in a way, that's also implied by the Duchampian strategy of appropriation as an artistic gesture, because there you don't even have to have the skill to be an artist, except perhaps the skill in thinking. So to me, art is an extremely open situation. And I think the days when calling somebody an artist was in itself a term of glorification are long, long past. So I'll just start with that observation. Second thing I will say is that the long-standing debate between art and craft as these two categories, and the question of how they engage with one another, I think is founded on a basic misperception or misunderstanding, because they just aren't similar categories at all. I said this at the beginning of thinking through craft, so that might ring a bell if those of you have read it. To me, the word craft is a lot more like the word color than it is like the word art. In other words, art can be colorful, it can be about color, artists can think about color and deal with color when making the art, but you don't have a debate about whether color is the same as art or it has equal status. You wouldn't even think of putting the question to yourself. And I wish that we had never gone down the road of asking that kind of question about craft. I think that was a massive mistake, and probably an inheritance that we had from the arts and crafts movement. And it no doubt results from the essentially this class division between tradesmen, let's call them tradesmen or artisans on the one hand, and fine artists who were trained in academic circles in the 19th century. And that was obviously a hierarchy. And so instinctively to us today, it seems like the way to deal with that is to venerate the craftsperson and give them the status of artist. But as I said, giving somebody the status of artist is no more than a simple choice. It doesn't venerate or glorify or elevate in and of itself. That's the first point. And the second point is that you've made a fundamental category error if you start to think about craft and art as two terrains or categories that can be related to each other in terms of status. And again, an obvious way of putting this is that a piece of art can be well crafted, but a piece of craft cannot be well arted, at least in the same sense. They're not really reversible terms or parallel terms. So that's just to park one set of your questions over here. I think there's another question you're asking, which is a really serious one for me to consider, which is, what about creativity and innovation in authorship? Because obviously these craftspeople or the repair people at Brass Lab are responsive or reactive to another person's creativity. And I guess my feeling is that far from thinking that that has no place in a museum, that is exactly what I want to glorify and venerate. Because I think in the 21st century, what we should be celebrating is collaboration, flexibility, the ability to understand other people's needs and ideas and respond to and support them adequately. We should be rewarding conversation, we should be rewarding collaboration, and we should be recognizing people who help other people do things in the world. And those people are often makers. And I think the idea of only recognizing the genius who has the idea is, to me, a 20th century habit that I want to get over. So I have, I think, a quite different set of instincts about that question. And also, one last thing, I realize I'm giving you a long, long answer, but one last thing to say about that is that, of course, our museum inhabits an ecosystem. You know, we're a small museum by New York City standards. We've got the Metropolitan, the MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the New Museum, the Cooper Hewitt. You know, there's lots of museums around. And it seems to me there's plenty of room for one museum to have that level playing field where the crate maker, the fabricator, and the artist are dealt with on level terms, because sure as shooting, that's not going to happen at the MoMA. right? And so our narrative can juxtapose itself and contrast with their narrative in a way that I think opens up some really useful and interesting space.
Take one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Kaufman as well. Okay. One, go ahead.
This is sort of a continuation of what you just said regarding the many hands exhibit. It's sort of traditionally the three parameters will be placed linearly. There's an idea, there's the fabrication of the idea, and the packaging of the idea.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much you're going to work the angle of the interplay. This is a designer's perspective of an artist, for instance, visiting a foundry or some other technology, and how the outcome is finally different because of the way things were taken into account, the size of the doorway you had to get through.
Yeah.
And whatever that has to do with the ping pong that took place before the final outcome
Yeah.
materialized.
That's a great question. So the question is, to what extent is the Fabricator show going to challenge this kind of linear model of how the art process happens, where you have the idea and then the fabrication and the distribution system, and instead, in fact, introduce this idea that there's actually a conversation that's dynamic between all those different processes and stages. And you are absolutely right. And that's quite, that's sort of implicit in what I was saying about the fact that we're prioritizing artists who have a conceptualized or considered relationship to fabrication. In practice, what that usually means is that they're including their fabricators in the creative process in some kind of dynamic or idea-rich way. So it's absolutely the case that artists learn as much from their fabricators as the other way around. And any artist will tell you that. And in fact, Kiki Smith said something really fantastic to me about this, which is that she does all of her best learning now at her fabricators workshops because she meets other artists who are also working with them. And of course, she talks to these technicians and the people running the shop, and she comes up with loads of ideas. So she says basically it's like graduate school for professional artists because it's an information exchange. And by the way, that's exactly what historians recently have said about medieval cathedrals. All the technology of building cathedrals was passed along orally on the work site, right? Which makes sense. And it's exactly the same for fabrication studios today. And I think that to capture that and somehow give voice to it in an exhibition, I think would be absolutely magical. And it really does pull back the curtain on something that I think for most people is totally obscured, which is, of course, the whole point of having a museum in the first place. Last question, sorry.
In general, the whole atmosphere, what is a museum? Yes, but I'm going to see whether if you're going to show us, glorify the crate builder, to build a crate for such a sculpture is not a big deal. I mean, to build a crate for a big turbine is a much greater.
Sorry, to build a crate for a
turbine.
electric turbine, yeah.
Or to die cast a turbine. It's much more sophisticated than this, because you're attaching everything to the art world. But if you are taking the process, I'm an industrial designer. If you're glorifying those processes, then show really the extreme or the art of those processes, which is not this. Then the question is, what is your museum? Because now it's a kind of a backstage, I'd say beautified world, or a kind of excuse that you are there, it will show your activity also, but those activities have their, I'd say, extremes, which are not here.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. So in case you didn't hear it, the gentleman's just saying that in the whole overall world of crate building a crate for an artwork is actually not that big of a deal. So how about building a crate for an enormous electric turbine, for example? And you are absolutely right. And in a way, that's the conversation that I kind of want to have. Like, most museums are faced with the question, which artist should we show? I would love to be faced with the question, which crate maker should we show? And
maybe if you're going to Detroit, you'll be showing those who make the crates
Right.
for the engines.
Right, so if we go to Detroit, for example, and we do a Detroit Makers edition of this, we would, of course, want to have the auto industry captured as well as these community gardeners and more grassroots people. I think that in this specific case, not to leap to my own defense, but in this specific case, I did really want to have our own backstage present, just for symbolic purposes. But you're absolutely right that in general, what we want to do is be showing the most challenging, demanding, and hence innovative and often beautiful version of whatever it is that we're showing. And in general, we have really tried to do that as best as we could at rapid speed and through this decentralized curatorial process that I've talked about, which undoubtedly is not going to produce anything like a kind of perfect result, but I think is going to be a very interesting result. And maybe I'll just make one last comment about this, which is that, you know, I've often been asked in this process, what about aesthetics? What about beauty? You know, aren't museums about, you know, things to look at the end of the day? And I guess my feeling, and this is something, again, that I think 100 years after Duchamp we can say with a great deal of conviction, is that there's absolutely no reason to prefer a sculpture to the crate that it came in. There's no reason to prefer a finished sculpture to a half-made sculpture. And there's no reason to prefer a painting to an electric turbine, necessarily. These are all matters of taste and subjectivity. And one thing that I love about making is that you can have the question, which crate maker should you show? And there's a kind of objectivity to that, which in turn, to me, generates the possibility of aesthetic insight, transformation, encounter, surprise, experience. And so that's obviously an ongoing project. Will we have a survey show of crate making in America? Probably not, to be realistic. But will we continue to explore unheralded, previously concealed, and fascinating byways, channels, and alleys in the world of making? I hope so. That's very much what I'm looking forward to. So thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Adamson, for broadening our view on craft. I actually have a student who graduated Bצלאל, and then she decided to become a tattoo artist, and she got really bad reaction, and I really hope she was here today to hear you. Thank you very much. אנחנו ניקח 10 דקות ואז נחזור לפאנל הבא, ויש עוד פאנל על